Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wet plate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wet plate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silver bath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 questions. In this bonus episode, sort of the baker's dozen of 10 questions, we're heading into the world of academia. Our guest this week really knows how to respect the chemistry for the last 20 years after receiving her PhD in chemistry from Yale University. Currently serving as the Director of Conservation for the Menil Collection and Vice President of the American Institution of Conservation, she has a fond love of the common tintype and has written multiple scientific articles about the materials used in their creation. Based in Houston, Texas, I'd like to welcome Dr. Corina Rogge to 10 Questions. Hi, Cory. Welcome to the podcast.
Chad, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm really happy to get you on the show and chat about the tintype photograph. Now, you yourself are a self-professed tintype geek, right?
That is correct. In fact, I sometimes refer to myself as the queen of the tintype because they are so understudied, and I'm one of the only people out there that has really devoted time and space and brain energy to their material properties.
Okay. Now, have you always been a fan of vintage photography, or was this something that your studies really pushed you into learning more concerning the tintype?
So I'd always liked photography as an art form, but this all began when I was teaching at Rice University, and I wanted to create courses that were interdisciplinary between art and science. And it became obvious that the single most perfect subject was photography, right? It's the art form that was founded by chemists. And so I developed a course that was on basically the making an analysis of alternative photography processes. And unfortunately, we couldn't do wet collodion methods there because the university didn't want us to be handling, gun cotton and other flammable substances.
That's no fun.
I know, such downers. But it really sparked my love of the history of photography. And then when I was looking around for research projects, it became apparent that tintypes were just so vastly understudied. And yet they were, for a long period of time, the single most popular photographic technique in the US. And so it was like, okay, I have the time, I have the space, I have the interest. Let's really dig in and learn more about these objects.
That's fantastic. So, before we really dive into the tintype, let's talk about that. You are a conservation scientist that dabbles in more than just tintypes, right? So, what other types of historical or cultural items fall under your purview?
So basically anything. I like to say that I do some things gracefully, and those include a lot of paintings. I work a lot with modern art materials these days. Things I do less gracefully might involve metal analysis for sculptures. But if there's an object in our collection, I end up being involved with it one way or the other.
Yeah, and maybe talk just a little bit about the collection that you have there at I guess it's the Menil Collection there in Houston. What types of objects would one find there?
So we're not an encyclopedic collection in that we try to collect everything, but we collect in areas around which our founders, John and Dominique, were interested. And that can include anything from Paleolithic art to Byzantine art to surrealism to modern and contemporary art. They were interested in art as a spiritual undertaking that connected humanity. And so that's kind of what they were focusing on. And that to them could mean, artwork that stretches back across the ages, or it could mean artwork that's very contemplative and very peaceful, artwork that basically invites people in. And part of that is photography. We don't have a huge photograph collection here, but we do have some.
Okay. So what's the, I guess, the oldest piece that you would estimate at?
We have a Paleolithic piece that's a bone carving of bison. And if I say the age, I'm going to get it drastically wrong, but it's tens of thousands of years old.
Okay. All right. Well, definitely much older than the common tintype for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah. What's the difference between restoration and conservation?
So in the past, restoration was it's an attempt to make objects look as brand new as humanly possible so that you would never know that they were aged, you would never know that they had experienced the vagaries of time. And these days, we do, as a profession, a lot less of that. We allow things to show their wrinkles, so to speak. And so we'll take different approaches depending upon what the object is, what is needed to allow the visitor to experience it as the artist intended. If it's a modern piece where we've interacted with the artist or the artist is still alive, we'll consult them on how far they want us to take a treatment, how should we take a treatment at all? Sometimes we don't. And then also we are have come to the realization that there are not enough conservators in the world to treat every single object. I once calculated that at the British Museum, there was like 1 million to 2 million objects per conservator. So you can't possibly set hands on every single object in the collection. And so we're kind of engaged now in treating the collection as a whole and trying to preserve it as the best we can through making sure that the environment is good. So, the temperatures are at the right set point, the relative humidity doesn't vary widely, that the light levels are appropriate for an object. So really preventive en masse consideration of how to make objects work. And these days, we tend as a profession to use the term conservation rather than restoration, just because of that difference between whether it's purely aesthetic or whether we're, allowing more space. But in other cultures, and in Spanish, for instance, you'll hear restoration still being used because the direct translation, conservador, is like a political conservative. And so they don't want to be confused. So it's not wrong to use the term restoration. It's just a little bit culturally dependent.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm assuming that you mentioned the British Museum there. I mean, that is a massively large collection of items, right?
Yeah.
I do have a funny story about the British Museum. My wife and I were in London, and I was hoping to go there and take a look at some of the collection. And instead of typing in the British Museum, I typed in it was like the London Museum or Museum of London, and their main exhibit was on the fatbergs that are there.
Oh,
So that was not quite what I was expecting.
no.
Yeah. So I've always been kind of fascinated by these videos online where they show people cleaning like old works of art and things like that, and they've got the Q-tips out and they're stripping off the years of varnish and scum and everything that's on there. Do you ever get to do that sort of work? Or are you just primarily on the conservation aspect?
So as a scientist, I don't actually get to treat the works of art. So I'll analyze them and I'll take samples, but it's the conservators that work in our department who are trained to do that type of thing. But and yes, they do. So our paintings conservator just finished removing the varnish off of a Magritte painting that's going to go out on loan. And when we looked at it, we had no idea that it was the varnish was discolored. It was, blue sky, white clouds. But then as soon as you get into it, you realize that we do so much visual compensation that in fact the varnish had discolored and it's a much more vibrant painting now. And those are always satisfying. Those are always things that our visitors love to hear about because they're very whiz bang and cool, and it's very evident what people have done when it's all finished.
Fascinating. All right, well, let's talk about the tintype. So, do you have a tintype collection that you've amassed just for personal reasons?
I do. So when I got started into this project, it became apparent that numbers were going to matter because a single tintype is, it's one dot in the vast starry field of space that is all tintypes. And so I began collecting through local antique stores in upstate New York at Buffalo, through eBay. I'm lucky enough to have a family collection of tintypes of now currently unidentified relatives who are lost to history. And then I've continued to kind of accumulate them as I find ones that I really like. So I've got probably, it's not a huge collection, but it's probably about 250 by now.
Okay, very nice. And I always hate it whenever, you go into antique stores and you find these pictures and you kind of mention that these people are kind of lost to history just because there are no markings, no indications of who they were, what the names were. I find that very sad, and we've talked about this on the show before, that I always make sure that whenever I do a portrait, I always give that to the person, and I've written their names on the back of it so that hopefully whenever that tintype ends up at an antique store, hundreds of years from now, that maybe there'll at least be a name associated with it and they can figure out who it was.
It's wonderful. One of the saddest ones I have is it's in a paper envelope, and written on the back is basically like Aunt Mary gone to God. It's like, oh, okay, so they noted that this person was deceased and somehow, she's gotten dissociated from her family and ended up with me. And at least she's not entirely lost.
Yeah. Do you have any other favorite or unique images in your collection?
So I think some of my favorites are completely just randomly collecting different lots. I ended up with two that have the same painted backdrop, which is just cool, right? You have an itinerant
Yeah.
photographer wandering around and taking photos, and you're like, oh, that's that same landscape. And then I've got one that has a family with a taxidermied owl, which I like.
Nice. That's a
And
unique
then
one.
yeah, and then this really weird one of a woman who's wearing a white hat that looks like a white witch's hat, except it has two peaks instead of one. So I have no idea what that fashion statement was. And
Okay.
I have never found another example of that in, style magazines of the time or fashion plates. But
Sure.
okay, it was her.
Yep. Are there certain things that you look for in these images now that you kind of know some inside story on the tintype? So you mentioned the kind of a similar backdrop. Things I look for like posing chairs and the head bracing that they would have used. A lot of times you can see the feet kind of sticking out behind the person. Are there little things like that that make images unique to you?
I really like kind of the classic three-quarter photography of a person. And when the photographer has just got, they've got a great lens, they got it focused, and it's just a lovely image. And because tintypes are so detailed when they're done right, that's what I love. And then I also just like the different colors of plates. A black plate can be really attractive, but I tend to find myself aesthetically migrating more towards the chocolate plates, just because they have that warmer, I think slightly more inviting tone to me.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We're going to talk about different colors here. So let's go way back. Let's go to 1868. And Matthew Carey Lea wrote in his Manual of Photography that melaniotypes and ferrotypes may be said to constitute the most ordinary and least artistic of photographic products. And it seems like the tintype was not getting much love even from the beginning.
No, it was not.
What was it about the tintype that you decided needed a closer look from a scientific standpoint?
Really, because for me, the fact that it was a popular and economically affordable, accessible item made it more interesting, right? This wasn't the elite who were being photographed. I mean, daguerreotypes are lovely, right? They are beautiful objects, but the numbers of people who could afford them were tiny. And all of a sudden, we've got this photographic technique that's everybody can have, right? Pretty much. A vast cross section of society now has a way to memorialize themselves, their beloved family members, and that just really made it an appealing means of study. You can argue about whether any given tintype has an aesthetic value the same way you could with a daguerreotype or an ambrotype, but all of a sudden, for the first time ever, we've got images of a swath of society that would have gone undocumented before.
Yeah, that's great. So, concerning your research, the first mention of your name and any of the work that you have done, I became aware of back whenever I was first getting into the practice. And it was there was a short write up on varnish formulations that I found on the Collodion Bastards site. So I don't know if you're familiar with that site or not.
Gerald Figel.
Yeah.
Yep.
And at the time, the thing that stood out to me as kind of a budding tintypist was this quote that was included, and it was from a war correspondent. And he was writing about the money to be made following the army around during the Civil War. And I think it was from a New York Tribune article. And I'll read it off here. They have followed the army for more than 1 year and taken the Lord only knows how many thousand portraits. In 1 day since they came here, they took in one of the galleries, so I'm told, 160 odd pictures at $1 a piece, on which the net profit was probably 95 cents each. If anybody knows an easier and better way of making money than that, the public should know it. Now, to
Yes.
me, this seems to indicate that the early tintype photographers were really more interested in the dollar than the actual art of it, right?
I mean, yes and no, right? They had to have a certain you can argue about whether it's art or craft, right? But people wouldn't have been lining up outside their itinerant tent to have their photo taken if they weren't actually making something that was in focus, reasonably posed and looked good like something you wanted to share. So, I mean, it wasn't the case where people were taking their photography kit out to monument sites the same way that they were with glass plate negatives. So yeah, different purpose, but whether it's for money, whether it's because you like doing it, I don't know. I don't see that as necessarily being wrong
Yeah.
or bad. It's just different.
Everybody's got to make a dollar, right?
Exactly.
In your article, that scientific article from 2013, and the name of it is The Varnished Truth, The Recipes and Reality of Tintype Coatings, you started with a sampling of 221 tintypes. So, how did you go about selecting those? Are those ones from your personal collection, or did you reach out to folks to kind of pull together that sample?
These were mostly from my personal collection. So I had, a lot of these were anonymous ones that I had just gotten again from antique dealers or off of eBay. I did deliberately set out to try to get a handful of stamped ones so that I knew that I had, Griswold plates, that I had Neff plates. But those are hard to come by and they actually tend to be more expensive when you're funding your own study collection. So those numbers were limited. And because I wasn't collecting them for the subject matter, I was just collecting them to be a broad expanse of tintypes. I wasn't looking for particular sizes or particular casings or anything like that.
Okay. Now, I guess that trying to take a micro sample of varnish off of a tintype requires maybe a very steady hand or some mechanical means to be able to do that. What's the process for actually collecting and analyzing these samples that you were using as a part of this study?
So it's called a micro chisel, and that's effectively what it looks like. It's the tiniest little chisel that you can imagine. It's about 0.75 millimeters wide, and basically under a microscope, I can go in and just scrape. And what's nice with tintypes is because they're layered like that, I can work at an edge, and I know that as long as I can still see the image material, right, I'm not oversampling and getting the Japanning layer as well. And sampling from tintypes honestly requires a lot less of a steady hand than from, a multi-million dollar painting. So it could be far worse.
Sure. Yeah. If you're kind of practicing on a $5 picture that you
Yeah.
picked up at the antique store, maybe you're not too worried about
Yeah.
it.
And because these, I should point out that, our field has a lot of ethics surrounding sampling. And so we always want it to be justified and to take the smallest sampling available to us that will answer a question and to do it from areas of damage. And tin types are nice in that they have a lot of areas and they tend to have had a little bit of a hard life. And so there's usually a little bit at the edge that's already ragged and you just make it ever so slightly more ragged.
Okay. So in this process of collecting them, I guess you mentioned that you want to make sure that you're not digging too deep, so you're not trying to get into the actual collodion layer or even into the Japan layer. How thick is a layer of varnish?
Oh, tiny, tiny thin. When I take samples, I take different kinds of samples. And so sometimes I just take a scraping. And that's how I was getting a lot of these varnish layers. For other samples, I'll take samples that go through the complete stratigraphy. So on a tintype, that would be the varnish layer, the collodion layer, and the Japanning layer, and maybe even the metal plate. And those cross-section layers get polished so that you end up having a sample that looks like a layer cake, right? You can see the various strata of it. And that's how I would usually go about measuring something that was so thin as a varnish layer. And so I don't have a good answer for you. I'd have to go back and look at old images and pull up my scale bars.
Sure. Yeah. As you were going through and taking these samples, and I'm thinking about my own experience as far as pouring varnish on plates, did were you able to notice, okay, this one has a very thick pour edge, or whenever they drain the varnish off the plate, this is probably the corner it came off of because it was thicker. I guess, did you notice those types of things as you were going through and taking these samples?
Absolutely. So you see that all the time. You see thumbprints, from people holding the plate. You see areas where they didn't get the varnish to the edges of all corners. So there's a lot of vagaries in what happens. But the well done ones are just the smoothest, most perfect varnish layer imaginable.
Yeah, and I would suppose similar to Jurassic Park, where you've got a mosquito that gets encased in some amber. I typically have, maybe a eyelash or something like that that might fall into the plate, and then it gets encased in varnish, and so it's there forever as well. So I don't.
I have never seen a bug, and I don't recall seeing any hairs or anything like that. So dust, yes, but I guess that's part of running a good tin type studio is you wear a hairnet like in a cafeteria.
So as far as collecting all these different samples, so now you've got over 200 different samples of varnish. What's the next step in your process to do the analysis?
So the next step for the varnish layers and for the Japanning layers as well actually was I moved to a technique that has a really long name. It's pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. And what I'm trying to do with that technique is to take something that's polymerized, the varnish or the Japanning layer, and I need to break it down into smaller molecules that can be more readily analyzed. So we do that by heating in the absence of oxygen. So we're not burning it, we're pyrolyzing it. So we're
Okay.
breaking down these polymers into little molecules, which then can be separated and detected by the mass spectrometer. And what's nice is that all of the varnish layer materials like damar and mastic and shellac and sandarak, they all have their own unique marker compounds that we can see when we do this pyrolysis. And so by looking at the material that comes off, we can say, oh, that's a compound that I know belongs to shellac, or oh, this is a compound I know belongs to a colophony or a pine resin. And so we can figure out what's present in that mixture by looking for these distinct markers.
Okay. And then I guess along with that, you may know what the constituents are. Do you have any idea of the different volumes of those that were used in the recipes?
That is really hard to do by gas chromatography, particularly with polymers, because the other thing, of course, that happens to all of the varnish materials or any material on the tintype is that it ages. And as it ages, its molecular constituents change. And so you're seeing different, depending upon the age of a material, you see more more of one type of marker compound or less of the other. And so it's really hard to backtrack to know how much was there originally because was it aged in the light? Was this in a frame? Was this in a really acidic photography book? Was this, in a dark basement? And so it would be really difficult to get actual proportions out, which is why I was pretty careful not to do that, other than to sometimes say a lot or no detectable, but not be like, well, this is, 70% shellac and 30% colophony.
Okay. So the typical recipes of today for the kind of make your own varnish varieties usually consist of alcohol, gum sandarac, and a little bit of lavender oil as a plasticizer. Now, your analysis showed that there were a couple other constituents that were even more prevalent in some of these historical recipes. Uh, any idea of what the most common ratios were between things like shellac and is it Pinacea? That's
Yeah, I mean,
sappy.
shellac is the single most common thing, and then you get pine resin in there, which is another kind of a plasticizing thing. So you get a lot of like modern paints that you want a smooth, glossy surface on can have a lot of pine resin. But yeah, shellac was there probably because it's relatively cheap. It's a really nice varnish. It's used on wood for a reason. It gives you a nice, durable surface that's not sensitive to moisture in the same way that some of the others are. It doesn't discolor as much as some of the other varnishes under long light exposure, so that's nice. The problem with it is that as it's made by the insect, it's got a lot of colorants in it that are not important to its performance as a varnish, but are not something you want on a tintype. So while you can use as a furniture varnish what's known as orange shellac, because you don't really care, it's the color of the wood that's mostly going to come through anyway, if you're putting orange shellac over a tintype or an amber type, you can get a distinctive orange color out that your customers or the artist may not have wanted.
Sure. Okay. What about the finish of these different varnishes? Was there anything, whenever I typically look at vintage tintypes, they seem to have a very matte type finish versus, a tintype that I might produce today, which has a very glossy, almost mirror-like sheen to it. Is that just because of typical wear and tear on the tintype? Is it something with the shellac that actually breaks down after decades and decades of being exposed to air, or was it something specific that's what they look like to start with?
You know, it's going to start out first and foremost being influenced by the plate, whether you've got a glossy plate or an eggshell plate. And then the photographer puts the collodion layer on that, and that is so thin it pretty much conforms to whatever the texture of the plate is. And then the varnish itself, it depends on what the varnish is, how well it's mixed, what its proportions are in the alcohol or whatever the other solvent bearer was, how fast the solvent evaporates out. Was it flamed off like they sometimes did, or was it allowed to dry naturally? So there's a lot of vagaries in how and what finish you get. And then, like you said, it ages.
Yeah, I would say for us modern tintypists, we try to avoid the flame off situation with varnish.
It's
It's
real dramatic.
it's very exciting. Yes. How does knowing what type of varnish was used impact the tintype from a conservation standpoint? I mean, are there different guidelines for different types of varnishes?
So, I mean, the different varnishes, so that they have different kind of long-term stabilities that we can understand. We can expect some to yellow more. We can expect some to be, more restrictive in what relative humidities they can take. If these were on a painting where we would be likely to remove the varnish, we would want to know what the varnish is because of the solubility, right? What solvents do we have to use to get it off safely and not unpack the underlying layers? tintypes don't often get that kind of treatment, and so it's less important there. It's really, for me, it was less about the conservation of these objects and more about just trying to unravel the correlate the history of how they were made with what people were writing about, right? I like that connectivity between the trade manuals and all of these, the marvelous stories that people are telling about how they do these things. And I'm telling you this history in very long, wordy 19th century kind of diatribes, and then the reality of it, right? And the reality of it was there were really complex recipes, but in fact, most people weren't using them because they were expensive and probably hard to use and less good than the simple recipes, but they're also not as impressive. So,
Yeah, so I was going to get to this. So I wanted to read your conclusion statement from your paper that says that the poor correlation between recommended tintype varnishes and the materials detected on the historical samples serves as a warning to art historians, conservators, and conservation scientists that practices and processes described in the contemporary literature were not necessarily followed by artists of the day. So essentially, you're saying don't believe everything you read, right?
it is true, and that sounds harsh, but it's not just tintypists that were doing this. I found it across all art forms and individual artists, which is that an artist will tell you something, and are they do they actually remember, or are they misremembering? Are they telling you because they firmly believe that this is the way it should be done, even if they didn't necessarily do it, but they're going to tell you that they did it because it's the importance of doing it that, overrules the reality and the truth. There's a lot of stories that get told. And so with science, the kind of science I do, there's a lot of we listen to what is said, we read what is said, and then we verify. So trust but verify.
Trust but verify. Yeah, I always wondered if there was some level of secrecy going on in some of these early manuals that was really there just to kind of throw people off, you know?
Yeah, I haven't, in terms of the tintypes, I never found anything that was like, oh, that's bad. Ooh, you do that, you're going to ruin stuff. I think there was a lot of stuff that was just incomplete, which is a way of keeping trade secrets of your own. Like, I mean, not a lot was written about Japanning anywhere, whether on tintypes or on enamelware or anything like that, because it was so tradey, right? And once you had a system worked out, you didn't want that stolen and being used elsewhere.
Sure. So as you did your research, Corey, what were maybe some common myths about tintypes that you discovered and maybe were able to disprove outside of the varnish formulations?
Um, I mean, the thing I think that surprised me the most was the idea that these were easily made objects that, particularly the plates themselves. There was a lot of labor that went into making a tin type plate that I think goes unappreciated now. So I don't know that that's necessarily a myth, but it's there. In terms of actual photographers who were working, I guess for me the biggest myth is just that these are unattractive objects. I got a lot of questions from colleagues and in conservation and art history of, why am I wasting my time on this? Who cares about the tintype? Well, I think the tintypes are worth being cared about.
I agree. I agree. I guess concerning the care of these vintage tintypes, are there certain environmental conditions or practices that modern collectors should be concerned about?
So the good news is that if you have a tintype, you've got a really stable object as long as you don't let it rust. So I often like to think that compared to my digital records, which, a single kazat of a lightning bolt could fry my computer hard drive and all of that data would be lost, a tintype is a really good, carefully made object. And so, keep it in good relative humidity so that it won't rust. Don't get it above 70%. Don't let mold grow on it because that doesn't help anything. If you keep them on permanent display, the light can impact the varnish and the collodion layer. So keep it out of anything that has UV light. And then if you can keep it glazed and kind of limit direct sunlight, you'll help the longevity of these things as well.
Okay, that's good to know. I guess I kind of always assumed that, hey, these things have made it this long. Sticking it out in the sun's probably not going to hurt it any, but I guess the aging of the varnish is probably something to consider there.
It is, and it's not, again, varnish layers can be removed. It's just a question of finding somebody who would be willing to do that on a tintype because it's not a common practice.
Yeah, let's say that I've got a vintage ferrotype that appears to be coated with, some grime and gunk and who knows what else. Are there acceptable ways to clean a tintype?
Um, yes, but it would highly depend upon what the varnish material is. So it's one of those things that it would be better to consult with somebody who's got experience with cleaning varnish materials rather than anything else because you know you could use water in a swab, but if you then render the varnish on your tintype opaque because of crazing of the varnish, you've just lost the legibility of the image, and that's not what we would recommend.
Sure.
So in a way, benign neglect is the best. You know, dust them with a nice soft brush and keep them framed if you can, and you know, let them out to view when you want to and away from direct sunlight and water.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because, Sanderac finished tintypes, even if they're modern ones, are much more prone to water damage and becoming opaque versus a shellac type finish, which seems to be a little bit more water impermeable than some of the other formulations that are out there. So I was going to say that I once received an ambrotype from my friend Shane Bakowicz, where the Sanderac had stuck to the mailing envelope,
Ugh.
and I ended up stripping the varnish off the plate using a barely diluted Everclear alcohol solution, and then reapplying a new coat of varnish. Is that going a little bit too far with a vintage image?
Done well and carefully, not necessarily, right? Because you have to balance if it was completely, if you can't show it and you can't see the image, you've lost all of that information, you've lost the aesthetics of it, right? And if you can remove the varnish and the stuck-on material in a way that doesn't impact the collodion, which you can see, right? Because otherwise all of a sudden you'd have no image there. It's not a bad thing to do necessarily. And particularly if it's your own object,
Yeah.
right? I mean, working in a museum, we have more of an ethical mandate to consider the future. But if you're making these or they're your objects, you've got a little bit more leeway because you live with them in a way we don't.
Sure, sure. Well, Corey, we've talked about the top layer. Let's move on to the bottom. So, what was the motivation to then go and look at the Japan layer of the tintype?
So basically, again, it was there's there's millions of these things out there. They were made by manufacturers, and yet there's very, very little that was written about how things were actually done. And then, so how were they, right? Okay, you've got this description of multiple bakings or not bakings or what people were using. But again, it was just can this at all be sorted out? Can we sort reality, fact from fiction? And then also, one of the things that became apparent is that although not most tintypes are not considered important, every so often there'll be a tintype that comes to market of a famous sitter. And then the question is always, is it authentic? Is it not authentic? Is it from the right time period? And so I thought that maybe contributing a little bit more to the literature about here's what authentically old Japanning layers look like would be useful. And then, okay, can we parse out manufacturers? Is that even better? Because manufacturers came in and out of, business. And so, would it be possible to take an anonymous tintype and be like, oh, this is probably this kind of a plate, and that kind of a plate was manufactured in these dates? And so, yeah, maybe that is an authentically old image, or at least it's an image on an authentically old plate.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's important to share with everyone that photographers were not necessarily making their own ferrotype plates, right?
Oh,
This was a manufactured product.
yeah.
Hamilton Smith patented the process of photographic pictures on Japan surfaces in 1856, so it came just after the introduction to the wet plate collodion process around 1849 to 1850. This was essentially a business that somebody thought, oh, well, this would be a great idea, and I could sell this material to all these photographers that are out there. Any idea how many different manufacturers there were over that, 30 or 40-year period?
Oh, there were a lot. I mean, Neff and Griswold were the first original ones, but then you get Anthony, you get Hedden and Holmes, and then just ambiguously named ones that you don't know what they were. So I don't know. I don't feel comfortable in the amount of digging I did to know that I captured all plate manufacturers. But you're absolutely right. This is not something a photographer would want to do by themselves. It was noxious. It Factories caught fire because they're heating and baking things that are essentially oil, and we know that oil likes to catch fire. It's not an easy thing to do. So yeah, you buy your plates and your boxes of plates and don't try to make them yourself.
Yeah. I've got a really good book that talks about the history, and I think it's called The Tintype in America by Schimmelman, maybe. I don't
Yeah, it's
recall.
one of the best single monographs written on tintypes.
Yeah. What really amazed me is that there's just no information really around that talked about how these plates were actually produced. I mean, you've got these massive factories that probably had a lot of people working in them, but there's no real detail on how many times they were baked. Some people say it was they had to bake it multiple times, and others were like, oh, well, they figured out how to just bake it once. But there's no real good information on what that process actually looked like. It wasn't documented very well, it doesn't seem like.
No, it isn't. And in fact, so there's, very little, there were very few modern, contemporaneous descriptions of how they were done, largely probably because it was trade secrets. And so I'm going to forget which one it was, but there's the scurrilous, like, another company has lured the master Japaner from one company away to work for them. And yeah, it was not a published process. And it's easy for us to forget how many things we take for granted will not be preserved for history because nobody thought it important enough to write down.
Yeah. Yep. Well, you had mentioned that you went around and collected some known manufacturer plates, and I think a lot of folks that maybe don't deal with these vintage images realize that occasionally you will find plates and they will have a stamping on the back that lists who the manufacturer was, or maybe if you're even lucky enough to have a box or envelope that has the original plate in it that's not even been used yet, then you might be able to collect some information from that. Were you able to use the same tintypes for the varnish study as these, or did you go out and try and select other ones to kind of collect that known starting point?
So I did go out and deliberately collect Neff and Griswold and adamantium plates because they were some of the ones that could be tied to known manufacturers. So stamping also takes time. And so Neff and Griswold were pretty much the only people who ever stamped their plates. Nobody else did. And so they're the only ones that it's super easy to tie a tintype plate to a manufacturer. Anthony and Co. adamantium ones were tipped into books so you can know what they are that way. But otherwise, unless you're lucky enough to come across a box of unused tintype plates that happens to be labeled, you've got just a lot of anonymous plates out there.
Yeah. Were you able to find stampings on all different sizes of plates? Or was it that, maybe they stamped a larger size plate and then a photographer just cut it down to whatever size that they needed? And then maybe you didn't
Um,
get that stamping.
I didn't I didn't have a lot of access to whole plates, so that's possible. My Neff and Griswold plates on the adamantium plate are all quarter plates, and the Neff and Griswolds were individually stamped. You can cut your own plates, but you end up with ragged shapes. And so depending upon how cheap you were as a photographer, maybe it's easier for you to buy your box of quarter plates than try to cut them. But a lot of people were cutting them because some of the sizes and the angles of the plates in my collection are very wonky.
Yeah, especially with some of the multiplying lenses that were used in the
Yeah.
Bontempi cameras. I mean, where you're taking 16 or,
Yeah.
50 images on the same plate and chopping them all off there.
Yeah, no, nobody would, yeah. For the multiplying ones, it was definitely the photographer did it afterwards.
Yeah.
And after varnishing as well, because you don't want to like trying to be varnished the little tiny gems. That would be a pain.
Yeah, I would say of all the tintypes that I have either owned or viewed in some collection, I've only seen one that actually had a stamping on it. So I'm assuming that it's not something that just you come across all the time, these
No,
manufacturer stamps.
no, it's like I said, it's passingly rare. The only ones I have are the Neff and the Grizzled ones. None of the other anonymous ones I have any stamping whatsoever.
Right. So you've got a cross-sectional image in your research paper that I think is pretty neat. How does one go about getting, a cross-sectional kind of dimensioned image of a tintype?
So it depends on whether you want the metal layer or not. If you don't want the metal layer, you can go in with the micro chisel I talked about earlier, or a really sharp X-Acto blade and just kind of, you're slicing the cake of the tintype, right? You're going down through the top and making a little incision and then scraping it off of the metal plate. If you want the metal plate, then what I did was I would go in with really, really, really sharp shears and try to cut little pieces off, which is more destructive and would not be anything I would do for a collection item. But again, for these kind of study materials that I considered more sacrificial, it was easy to take a corner.
Okay. And I'm assuming this is a similar process to what was used for analyzing the varnish layer. Is that correct?
Yes. So for the Japanning layer, I did use gas chromatography, the same process, to look at what the binders were. So in this case, they were mostly linseed oil. And then I'd used additional techniques to look at what the colorants in them were. So the black plates are colored with carbon, basically a carbon black, and you can see that under microscopy. You can identify what the pigments are that way. And then I used other techniques to look at the chocolate plates, which have iron-based pigments, and you can pick up the iron in a scanning electron microscope. You can look at it that way. And then there's tricky ways you can get at this by a completely non-destructive method, which is X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, but that gets into the real weeds of the subtleties of X-ray lines and thicknesses of layers and stuff. But basically, it turned out that you've either got carbon because it's black, or you've got iron earth elements because you've got a reddish or a brownish tone plate.
Okay.
And so I was looking there because the varnish layers aren't deliberately colored, right? So there, I didn't have to apply those techniques, but in the Japanning layer, I wanted to see both how many layers there were, what the binding material was, and then what the pigmenting material was.
And so you mentioned how many layers. So you were actually able to detect, like, if they coated it once, baked it, and then put another coating on it, rebaked it, that there's some delineation between those layers.
Exactly. So I've got one of my Neff plates has 5 layers on it in the Japanning layer. So they were, at that point, really building up a really thick, Japanning layer. And this was obviously not cost effective because the other Neff plate I have has a much simpler stratigraphy. And they were probably doing this both to help create a smoother finish. And then also because, as any person who's worked with silver nitrate knows, it's really reactive. And if you don't have clean baths and clean surfaces and clean everything, you can get a lot of image artifacts. And so pigmenting materials in the panning layer had the possibility of interacting with the imaging materials in the collodion layer and creating four images. And so I think that some of this early layering was their attempt to isolate the pigments from the image layer and then create hopefully a better product overall.
Yeah, for sure not a cost-effective way. It must have been an earlier
No,
plate.
yeah, it was a little crazy when I saw it. It was like, what? They can't possibly have this many layers.
Yeah. So we all know that there's two sides to every tintype. What are the biggest differences between the front and the back?
So the front is really, I mean, with a tintype, your image is coming, the whites of your image are coming from the silver image particles, and the darks are coming from the tone of your tintype Japanning layer. And so black or brown gives you that depth of color. On the back, the only purpose for that coating is to help protect the metal plate from rusting. So it's not, it has no aesthetic need, right? People weren't displaying the back. It has no function to the image. It has no function to the capturing of the image. It's really there just to not rust.
Sure. And I would say, at least of the samples that I've seen, the back appears to be kind of hastily applied. A lot of times
Yeah.
there's little bubbles and runs and things in it, and definitely not
Yeah.
as thick. Or
Yeah.
maybe it's the coloring that's in there. It's definitely, you can see through that layer to the iron plate underneath.
Yeah. Again, I didn't measure the thickness of those layers, but the back is always thinner and unpigmented because there
Sure.
was just no need for it. And why waste money and material?
Yeah. So you mentioned linseed oil, or drying oil, I guess it was listed as. I guess the biggest surprise to me, based on like more modern day recipes, is the lack of asphaltum.
Yeah.
If you go and do modern day ferrotypes, that's one of the key ingredients is asphaltum, but that's not what they were using back then. So you mentioned carbon black, which, or lamp black, I think maybe is just very fine carbon pigments that you could put in there. Really.
It's cheap. It dries better. Like, not having made my own tintype plates, I can't speak to this, but we see paintings that are made with asphaltum containing paint that have the most horrible, reticulated, cracked paint layers because asphaltum is such a problematic material for drying. And maybe with tintype plates, it's not quite so bad because you're baking them, you're not allowing them to dry naturally, but it's not a nice material to work with.
Yeah. And I'm not familiar with these oils, but linseed oil is a type of drying oil. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. So drying oil is exactly what it says. It's any oil that dries, and that can be linseed oil from flax. That can be fish oils will dry. Sunflower and safflower oils will dry, and then you have non-drying oils, which in your kitchen would be like coconut oil. They don't have the right chemical constituents and bonds to create a polymeric network, so they stay liquid forever.
Yeah. Was it possible to tell if the verso varnish was applied to the front side japanning layer, or was it only used on the back?
Based upon the cross sections I took, it's really only applied on the back. And they're not always necessarily, I mean, one's pigmented, one's not, but they don't even necessarily have the same formula either.
Which that seems
So,
to complicate the manufacturing even more, right? I mean,
yeah, it does. But on the other hand, maybe it's also, if they don't care quite so much what goes on the back, you aren't tied to using such expensive material. You can mix your batches more, right? You've got a little bit left in this bottle and a new bottle, so you're just going to mix them and it's all going to be okay because it's going to go on and it's going to dry and nobody's going to see it. So you just don't care.
sure, sure. So again, it seems like just because a patent says something, so when you look through the patents, you see certain constituents listed there. Maybe that's not quite the full story, right?
Exactly, because again, these are complicated things to make. They're hard. You want to use material that will get the surface that you want and the color that you want, but is also going to be cost effective both in terms of purchasing the material and in terms of time, right? Baking it 5 times to put separate layers on is not a good use of your time if you're trying to run a money-making enterprise. And so they were really balancing things that way. And I've always thought what would be really interesting is there were occasional people that were making tintypes or Japanning in other countries. And so what were they using? Are there cultures of plates? But we just don't know.
Yeah, at least from the book that we mentioned earlier, it seems like the ferrotype was really a very American centric type form of photography, at least in its terms of usage. I mean, I'm sure they were doing it elsewhere, but it really took off here.
It did, and it's again kind of funny the way that that happened, right? I haven't parsed out all the societal reasons for it, but it did never catch on the same way as other things. Although I've occasionally come across, tintypes, I think even named ones, although I'm not going to remember whether it was a Neff or a Griswold plate that was made in England. So people were exporting plates for photography there, and it was never the fashion.
Yeah. Well, with all this knowledge that you've got now about the ferrotype plate, have you thought about starting up your own Phoenix plate company and producing modern ferrotype plates?
No, because I know exactly how hard it is. But it is interesting to me that the modern plates being made don't look at all from a scientific standpoint like the historic ones. And so what are they, do modern tintypists, here's a question for your audience, do modern tintypists see any difference in aesthetics between the plates that they're using now versus the historic ones? Do they like it? Do they not like it? Do they care that it's not the same, plate that people were being used? So that's my
Yeah.
conundrum.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with a few different folks, and I would say that the biggest proponent of ferrotype plates that are out there today would be someone like John Coffer, that still manufactures his own ferrotype plates, and would argue that the chocolates and in the rich colors that you get off of that type of a plate is far superior to what we typically use on alumina types, a trophy plate aluminum that has a black enamel finish. And I would tend to agree, yeah, there's definitely a big difference there from an aesthetic standpoint, that you just don't get that same type of color with the modern equivalents. But then I think John has also conceded that if the photographers of that day would have had access to trophy plates, that they would have probably used trophy plate aluminum back then as well. So
Yeah, I mean, you use what you got. John was kind enough when I was doing this work to send me a sample of his plates, and they do look entirely different from the historic ones in terms of like the cross-section samples. So there's no doubt that are not they are being made into similar processes, but whether one is better than the other, as long as people are happy with them, that's all that matters.
sure.
But
Yeah. Well, Cory, let's talk about your own personal experiences with the collodion process. Have you ever had your likeness or your portrait taken using the collodion process?
I have, because I was lucky enough to participate in one of Mark Osterman's workshops at the Eastman House. And so we weren't doing tintypes. I have never taken a tintype. I will admit that. But we did amber types and glass plate negatives. And so I have an amber type photograph of myself that's in a closet somewhere because it was taken many years ago. And it's now kind of embarrassing how old it is, or at least how old I am.
What what was the experience like seeing this photographic process firsthand after studying these vintage examples for so long?
It's amazing to me. I mean, the the skill that goes into handling the plates and the authority which only experience can bring as you do things really can't be overestimated. So, everything from how carefully you have to cut the glass and how carefully you have to clean it, to standing there with Mark, telling us, okay, now you're at this, now do this, right? Because he has seen the process so much. He knows when it's time to stop development, when it's time to wash. Because of the weather, when we were doing this, we were having trouble with with the development bath, and he just has enough know-how to diagnose it. And so the skill of the process is phenomenal. And then just, pouring the plates is really hard. You're getting fingerprints everywhere and you're dripping collodion down your arm because you've tilted it too much. And it really gives you an appreciation for what these photographers were going through. And then it's photography. It's just the magic of watching the image develop out in front of you. It's really nice.
Yeah, that's great that you got to go to Rochester and share in that experience firsthand with Mark and actually see it. It's not something that is in the everyday, right? And
Oh,
this is probably something that we should have discussed early on, but I find that the vernacular of tintype is really being lost in today's world. People, you say that word and they really have no concept of all what you're talking about, right?
nope, not at all. They don't have, unless they happen to have gone to an exhibition of modern tintypists, and luckily there are still people out there now who are practitioners, right? They really don't know. But then people don't know about film cameras anymore either, right? We're spoiled with our cell phones. And so, whereas I used to trot around with my SLR whenever I went anywhere, now it's like, oh, I've got my cell phone. I don't need to bring another camera. And so that's really sad.
Yeah. Well, at least it seems like there's a kind of a modern renaissance of wet plate that's occurred over the last couple of decades that I don't think the process is in any jeopardy of being lost to history. I think that there are plenty of new folks that are hearing about it. Maybe they're seeing some weird video on TikTok or Instagram and they're like, wow, that's pretty unique. I've never seen that before. What's going on there? And hopefully they try and dig into it. So I've got some hope that even the youngest folks that are out there will eventually pick this up. So
Hope so. And for, the alternative processes in general, because they create really beautiful images in the right hands. And that's an artistry that shouldn't be lost.
yeah, I'm even hearing that the cassette tape is making a comeback with young folks. So
Um, I blame Stranger Things for that, but that's okay.
Cory, thank you for bringing this scientific and historical perspective to the lowly tintype. If there are people out there that would maybe like to reach out to you and maybe ask a question, maybe it deals with conservation or maybe they're interested in the Menil Collection, what's the best way for folks to get in contact with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, which is dead easy if you're involved in that network. We have, the Menil Collection is online, and then we have, I'm not going to remember it offhand because I never email it. We have a info@menil.org. You can email that and say that this is a conservation related question and it will get to me. And yeah.
Cory, thank you so much for being on the show. You're really our first guest that's not really had hands-on experience with the process, but you've got tremendous knowledge from a historical and scientific standpoint, and I really do appreciate you sharing it with the listeners. And I hope that you go out and get a updated wet plate collodion portrait taken soon. If there's anyone in the Houston area that could maybe help Cory out, please reach out to her and let's get a new portrait taken.
And I'll be happy to show off my collection of 200 whatever tintypes to people with the stuffed owl.
The stuffed owl. Fantastic. Great. Thanks a lot, Cory.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet plate journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests. and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.